Senator Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This raises so many interesting issues, and I can see there's a lot of things that are intangible, exciting candidates, close elections, right? There's working out how to make it easier to register, keep it secure, registering, and make it easier to vote. And I think the Colorado model sounds like a very interesting model for us to consider, because it might really take care of the registering and voting piece of this. I've been interested in the impact of money on voter turnout. I notice that it seems as though turnout is trending down in all states, not just California, even though it seems to be particularly acute here. But I just wondered if you had any sense of that at all, Mr. Secretary, especially now with the top two primary, which really means you're talking well over $1 million because you have to run very, very hard in 2 elections. And it's about $700,000 in each, as we know, just this normal expenditure. So, and just when you read the press and other things, that people get discouraged and they think their vote or their contribution doesn't matter because the large sums of money mostly come from organized groups.
Right. Well,
and I just wondered if you had any comments on that. And then
sure. I mean, I believe that the focus of the hearing and this Colorado model we've been discussing is not even the registration piece. That's already, my proposal's already in bill form, working its way through the Assembly. We're talking here on the elections administration side and giving voters more convenience, more choices, more flexibility in when, where, and how to cast their ballots. But to your question about, the role of money in politics, you're right. As a general trend, participation seems to have been going down while money is going up. If we really look more closely at where the money is, it's much more in super PACs and independent expenditure committees than it is the amount of money being raised by candidates themselves. So, for exploration or consideration purposes, I'd call our attention to that distinction.
Do you track? I know that you track and post individual contributions to candidates and also super PACs, right?
All committees. Yes.
Yeah, all committees. Do you do aggregations or generalizations, like over time, is the money up or down? Where does the money come from? That kind of thing that could give us an overview?
Yeah, I mean, all that information is public information. Unfortunately, our current Cal Access system doesn't make it very user-friendly to provide that information in a more, easier to digest format, but we're working on it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. All right, well, we really appreciate your time, Mr. Secretary, and I know we've got a lot of exciting things coming up with regards to a legislative package, and so I'm looking forward to our next meeting on that and having you come frequently as we try to explore ways to address this extraordinary issue of voter turnout challenge that we have here in the state. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for your time. Look forward to working with you.
All right, so we'll next hear from some folks who joined the Secretary in Denver for the May 5th election, and we've got 3 wonderful panelists. John Gardner, who's the Assistant Registrar of Voters from Solano County, who traveled to Colorado. Ted Jackson, Community Organizing Director for the California Foundation for Independent Living Centers, and then also Astrid Garcia Ochoa, Deputy Director of the Future for California Elections. And they're going to come up, talk to us, give us their observations from the trip, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities. And we'll first hear from Mr. Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is John Gardner. I'm the Assistant Registrar of Voters for Solano County. I'll keep my comments brief in hopes that we can answer a lot of questions and hear from other folks. Before working in California, I did work for 10 years in the state of Colorado, both at the county level and at the state level. So I'm familiar with a lot of the changes that took place over time. And I think that's kind of important because Colorado kind of primed their voters over time. They had a formal early voting process for 14 days prior to election, which captured about 20% of the vote. And that's not voting by mail, that's just regular in-person voting. And then they also moved to this vote center model where they eliminated assigned polling places, the traditional polling places, and then that essentially expanded early voting to election day. And then we have where we're at today, where mail balloting is their full process and all counties participate in that. So specifically in Denver, we were observing the municipal election. This is the all-mail ballot election with voter service poll centers. And these locations provided the registration and in-person voting services for voters. This was 8 days prior to the election. Denver was piloting a tablet-based marking device for voters. Officials expected less than 3% of an in-person turnout, and I think our observations support that. I personally visited 4 different locations throughout the day, and over the course of 8 days, these locations captured between 20 and 30 total in-person votes. So it's a very low number. There were some places where we didn't even see an in-person voter during the half hour to an hour that we were there on election day.
Sounds like California special.
So due to this lack of voters, we had ample time to discuss process with the workers and the Denver officials. And some of these poll workers had been there for many years and had worked through all these different changes. So they're familiar with issues that had come up and been resolved over time. In 2006, when Denver first switched to the vote center model, they in particular had issues with their electronic poll book system causing delays, and they worked through those. And later, when their statewide voter registration system was launched in both 2008 and 2012, they also had delays from their electronic poll books. So that's something that we need to consider as well as we move forward. They did work all these issues out, and now the model that they have, everybody is really pleased with, and they had no issues. It really helps to have these locations open for 8 days because it minimizes any problems you could have on election day, right? All those issues get worked out in the first day. So that was very helpful. Right, technology is a big factor there. There's usually 8 to 10 staff members or poll workers that are at these locations. 4 of the workers were dedicated to what's called the check-in process, that electronic poll book. So you've minimized the number of locations you go to, but you've kind of increased the number of check-in points to hopefully process more people through there. They also had people that dealt with language translation services, supervisorial services. They had ballot-on-demand printer, a person dedicated for that, and a technology specialist that kind of helped out if any issues arose during the day. They also made sure they had people kind of roving through the areas throughout the day, different poll workers that would bring supplies, refresh things for the ballot drop-offs at the curb, empty ballot boxes, things like that, and then circle back to their downtown offices. So a lot of folks involved at each one of these locations. All the locations used by Denver are government-owned offices. These are called recreation centers. They had a secure space for voting that they could use for the time period, and they also were hardwired with a secure T1 line. Some of these, okay, the polls were traveling around, good, got that. So I think the best thing for the voters was the different options that were available. All the traffic that we saw was really out at the curb, doing the drive-up boxes, just car after car, dropping off their ballots with very little in person. But when somebody did come in person, they could request either a paper ballot or they could use their touchscreen tablet that they were demonstrating, and that provides some flexibility. And hopefully as we go forward in California, we'll have flexibility for our counties as well. And if there's anything that we can do to make steps along the way, rather than biting it all off at one time, I think we would support that as well.
Wait, would you prefer that approach, do you think? Because it would be easier transition?
Personally, I would, yes.
Yeah.
If there were parts that we could implement now to start, especially educating our voters, if we're going to drop the number of polling places significantly, if there were some interim steps we could make to kind of get halfway there. In a county my size, if we think of a city that has 40 traditional polling places, if we drop that down to, pick a number, 4, that's a drastic change for those voters. If there was some middle ground that we could come to, or if we had an election where we could statistically show why we're reducing, because these are low performing polling places or something like that, because we've gone to all vote by mail, something like that, that would really help us out with our citizens.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Gardner. Well, we'll next hear from Astrid Garcia Ochoa, followed by Ted Jackson, then we'll have a chance for people to ask questions.
Good morning, Chair Allen, members of the committee. My name is Astrid Garcia Ochoa. I'm the Deputy Director for Future of California Elections, and thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today and share my recent observations in the Denver election. I submitted written testimony with greater detail, and so I'm just going to do some highlights so not to repeat some of what's already been said. But essentially, I was there as part of a two-day event hosted by Denver Elections and their vendor. And on day one, we learned about the Colorado model and also the new voting system, which was really highlighted during this event. I learned that the Colorado model, as we know it and as we observed, was created by HB 1303, passed in 2013. And there's really four elements to that Colorado legislation. It calls for proactive list maintenance, voter registration modernization, a new ballot delivery model, and the vote centers. Colorado is very active about its list maintenance to keep accurate voter registration rolls and to reduce the number of undelivered ballots. Colorado has a statewide database, and it's had this since at least 2008. They're a member of ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, since 2012. And it's my understanding that they also use the National Change of Address database maintained by the U.S. Postal Service to clean their list on a monthly basis. We already heard Secretary Padilla reference their voter registration modernization, which just requires a 22-day state residency requirement, so voters really can vote wherever they want and they're not tied to where they live. And then the other large aspect of it is the voting service and polling centers. And they're service centers because they provide more services than just being able to vote. The vote centers offer same-day registration. You can go and update your voter registration. You can register to vote on that same day. You can access in-person voting, and they also are ballot drop-off sites. I visited 5 of the 7 vote centers, and all of them were in community centers. I did visit one in a police station, and generally these were a short walking distance from public transportation. The layout was very open floor concept, as has been noted, and there was lots of about 5 laptops for the check-in station, 1 laptop for the technician who provided the ballot on demand or the tablet voting. And all of these laptops were networked to the statewide database to access real time. Vote centers were also set up to assist voters with special needs, and I'll defer to my colleague Ted Jackson to talk about access for voters with disabilities. Right now, I'll just comment that there were services for limited English proficient voters. Denver is covered for Spanish language assistance under Section 203 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so the signs and the election materials were available in Spanish. And at least one vote center, I did observe that the poll worker wore a badge identifying that they spoke Spanish. I also observed in all of the vote centers a backup system. It was a large wood cabinet that had copies, paper copies of the ballots, of each ballot type. And I learned that this is actually the old way of doing vote centers, that they just had this large cabinet with many shelves to keep the paper ballots. Voters had 2 additional methods of casting a ballot, and we've already heard the drop-off ballot boxes. These were large, heavy-duty boxes fixed and bolted down to the ground. They're accessible 24 hours a day and are near 24-hour surveillance cameras. And all of the sites are on the Denver Elections homepage. The drop boxes are outside of libraries, near transit lines, near government buildings, and even near the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So really public places that people use on an everyday basis. And the drive-throughs were outside of the vote center. So that's where they were located. There was a designated space. And I think on this May 5th for the election was especially useful for voters because it was raining. And so voters just pulled right up and handed off their ballot box and watched the poll worker cast it on their behalf. And all of them got their I voted sticker before they drove away. Most of the activity, as has been said, was actually outside at these drive-thrus. I think they were especially useful because people didn't have to bother looking for parking and were able to just hand off their ballot. In closing, observing the Denver election was very informative and it was inspiring, but the experience also raised many questions for me. I wanted to know what steps Colorado has taken to get to where they are. What were those building blocks? How were communities engaged to inform the new policies, and how were voters transitioned to the new system? What technology at a minimum is required to have a Colorado model? These were among my many questions, but in my short 2-day trip, I wasn't able to get answers to everything, but I did learn a few things. I did learn that Colorado's model did not happen overnight. As has been said, it was several years of thoughtful work by many stakeholders to get to the Colorado model. The new policies were favored by many because the electorate was already moving in that direction. Counties, both large and small, had high rates of voting by mail. And Colorado took on the modernization process as a step toward creating a uniform election experience for their voters across the state. And so we've heard that it wasn't just uniform through the policy, but also they're looking at a uniform voting system. I also learned that Denver is the standard, but it's also the exception. It is a geographically compact county at 153 square miles, and it also has unique access to funding and technology that other counties don't have. I learned that Colorado is indeed still fine-tuning its model. The November 2014 general was the first time conducting an election under the new model, and it has resulted in several recommendations for election 2016. These recommendations were made to the Colorado General Assembly just last month, and the report calls for several technical and operational improvements to build an even better voter experience next election. In closing, I continue to have many questions about the Colorado experience, but it has left me with the knowledge that flexible voting options are possible, given the right policies to develop these processes and the right elements of support. Colorado is clearly committed to offering its electorate voting options and is leading the way nationally to a modern election experience that puts the voter first. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Garcia. We'll next hear from Ted Jackson from the California Foundation for Independent Living Centers.
Thank you, Chair Allen and members of the committee for inviting us here today. The opportunity to observe the Colorado model during the Denver municipal elections with California's voting stakeholders was a great learning experience. The model is working in many respects for the state of Colorado, which, as we know, had very high voter turnout in the last election. A lot of the observing that I did was along with Astrid Ochoa, so we had some shared experiences. And I did see some positives to using this model, especially with the drop-off locations. They allowed for a lot of flexibility of when someone could drop off their ballot. The proximity to public transportation was good, that each one of these voting centers was close to public transportation, their locations, and the options and different ways of voting. As you know, accessibility is always a menu of options and not just one particular standard to live by for people with disabilities. However, we are a bit concerned that the model is serving a population less than 1/2 of the voters in Los Angeles County. So with more voters across the state of California, certainly there's going to be more amplified concerns. Geography and frequency of voting locations is also important to the disability community. While there is a longer period of time for a person to go in and vote, and the proximity to public transportation is possible, in rural areas that may not be the same thing. So we may actually, as we think through, does this model work for California, we may want to consider whether there is a metro model and a rural model. One of the things that was a little bit disconcerting is I kept asking the question of election officials, how does this play out in the rural counties? And no one could answer my question. Usually in the disability world, when someone can't answer our question, it usually means that they haven't thought through the accessibility in the plan.
Were you asking Denver officials or Colorado officials?
I was asking Denver, but I was also asking folks from their Secretary of State's office that we interacted with. And, you know, in addition to that, we did meet with a member of their Voter Accessibility Advisory Committee, who is a lawyer on voting rights issues with the state's largest disability rights organization. And she was not able to answer some of the specific questions that I had, as well as some of the questions that the Secretary of State's staff had. And so that was a little bit, disconcerting that we weren't able to get a picture of how communities were engaged in developing this process and making it better. The Dominion voting technology used in this model was very curious. While at first glance it appears to be very accessible, on closer scrutiny, it lacked the finishing touches to provide opportunities for an independent vote. I actually witnessed a blind voter struggle to vote independently on this particular voting machine. And it had a very clunky joystick, and then it had attachable items, but the county did not provide those items in the polling place. So the sip and puff device or the paddles that would normally be provided. There was an assumption that a person with a disability would bring those with them. And in the situation where you've got fewer vote centers, fewer locations, if someone doesn't bring that with them, for them to travel home, go back, get it, could possibly mean that they miss voting that day. Because of the length that they would have to travel, and almost definitely in a rural situation. So during the trip, while observing the election process, I had questions about barriers to access related to privacy, which the Secretary spoke about earlier. The accessible voting machines and all of the locations that we saw were turned open, and they were not private. Some of them were in one location, turned to a private situation. We got a curious response from an election official saying that they were turned so that the other voting booths had privacy. And so then I had to question, do people with disabilities get privacy as well in that situation? With location and proximity to public transportation, no one could answer the question in any of the vote centers where the closest public transportation was. I had to do that research on my own, so that was a little bit bothersome to me. And again, I already mentioned the availability of parable devices, and then of course path of travel. Because it was raining, they had moved at one location the tent for the street drop-off, the drive-up drop-off, but they had moved it into the path of travel. So a person in a wheelchair or power chair would not have been able to access that vote center that day. So there are certainly some things to learn in the structure of putting these vote centers together, their frequency and their adequate frequency in rural areas. My experience as a disability advocate is that if something is, if California wants to replicate the Colorado model, I suggest that we replicate their process to discover what is best for our own state and that serves all of our voters. This should include association with people with disabilities as valued stakeholders from the beginning of the process. Too often we have seen the best intentions of non-disabled actors to end barriers because people with disabilities weren't in an advisory capacity from the start. We should also consider our timeline without a rush to completion. They took several election cycles to do that. And of course, I think we need definitely need a large public education campaign that engages plain language. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. And of course, I presented a report. I turned in a report for all of you.
Really appreciate it, guys, and thank you so much for going out there and learning for all of us and bringing back this report. And I think we're all going to be in touch with you over various aspects of this. Well, let me ask my senators if they have any initial questions they'd like to ask the panel. Okay. I mean, effectively, it sounds like everybody was generally positive, though we've got a couple things we'd want to make sure would be beyond what you said. Did you come out of this experience? Did any of you come out saying that there's some aspect of it that absolutely we should make sure not to do? I understand and you did a good job of delineating some of your concerns with the implementation. But was there any aspects of the Colorado system that you would very much discourage us from adopting or looking at?
No. I mean, ultimately,
Okay.
I think providing options for voters was really the key to their system. The question comes up about how many locations per registered voter, how much to staff it based on what the anticipated turnout's going to be. And I think that's something Colorado is continuing to look at. How many of these locations, how many days will it be, what's the number per voters, how does it work when it's rural versus urban? And those are the things we have to consider for our voters, maybe in particular. And if there's some minimum standards that we go above and beyond, I think we'd all probably consider that on a case-by-case basis. But, ultimately, we're going to need the flexibility that if something changes or if we discover this isn't working, we would want to come back and be able to report, we need a new way to do this, like Colorado has been doing over years.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So,
As a representative of Future of California Elections, our network isn't ready to make a statement on whether or not California should have a Colorado model. I believe some of our members are in the audience and they may make public comment to that specifically. I've shared with them my presentation before. I think in general, all policies for election reform, one standard that we have as a network is to make sure that the needs of all voters are included in developing those processes, so the needs for voters with disabilities and the needs for limited English proficient voters.
right. Right.
And, I would say something similar to Astrid, that we're not ready to take an actual position on this from my organization. However, we have some concerns. I have some concerns. I left Denver with lots of big question marks. I saw some good stuff, but I saw a lot of things that I didn't get answers to, and that really concerned me. It really concerned me and made me wonder, are people with disabilities staying home? Are they filling out a vote-by-mail ballot reluctantly, which we hear anecdotally here in California quite a bit? The frequency of the vote centers, according to their law, there should be one per every 30,000 voters, but when I did the math on registered voters in Denver County, it was 59,000 for everyone. So
This was for a municipal election.
The code said per 30,000. So they can submit amendments to their Secretary of State in their election plan for local elections. But so that frequency piece is really, really important to us. And again, we're unclear about what advocacy or what relationship took place. People kept saying, oh, the disability community was involved in developing this, but they couldn't tell us how. And the former elections director from Denver was with us. So there were lots of big questions that leave a void to really be able to say yay or nay on this. Certainly there's some good things that we can learn from, but there's also some warning signs that we can learn from too.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much to the panel. Really appreciate you being here.
I
absolutely,
have
of course.
a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was to Mr. Mr. Gardner, yes. No, I'm interested in Mr. Jackson. Why do you hear that from the disabled community in California that you said they reluctantly filled out absentee ballots?
The Disability Organizing Network, which is a network I organize at California Foundation for Independent Living Centers, did a study of voters last year in the election cycle, and it's one of the issues that came up with our respondents. We're going to be continuing that effort, working with UC Davis to do focus groups with disabled voters over the next year, and hopefully we'll be able to dig deeper. But it's something that in my job, interacting with people with disabilities all over the state, that I hear a lot about. The sad truth is that we can't do a scientific study of voters with disabilities because we don't have extractable data about them from the voter file in the same way that we do Chinese speakers or Spanish speakers, et cetera.